Hello, I am Paul Miles with the International Society for Biblical Hermeneutics, and we are here with Daniel Weierbach, who is with C4C Apologetics, and he will be doing our first presentation in our current series on apologetics. Daniel, thank you so much. Take it from here.
All right. Well, thanks, Paul, for having me. And, it's an honor and a privilege to be here. I think I've done one and sat in on a couple. So it's always great to be around like-minded believers and those that are, very knowledgeable in various topics. And so I love iron sharpens iron. So I put in the abstract to go ahead and talk about what's known as the Christ myth theory. And so hopefully everybody can see my screen there. Let me see if I can make them bigger. There we go. And so, just a little bit
I'm
about
not
me.
seeing the screen here.
You're
You're
not
good. There
seeing
it
the
is.
screen?
Yep, you're good.
You
Go
got
for
it?
it.
All right. So, a little bit about me. I'm a father, I'm a husband. Me and my wife been married for going on 24 years now. I'm a pastor out in Prattville, Alabama, Central Alabama, out by northwest of Montgomery. I've been doing that for a little over 10 years. I also have a ministry online called C4C Apologetics. And so there we base it off of 1 Peter 3:15 and Jude verse 3, where we look at doing apologetics inside the church, dealing with false doctrines, and outside the church, trying to reach skeptics come to faith. And so that's a little bit about me and what I do. And so the Christ myth theory. Now, I just want to preface it by saying that I am by no means the foremost scholar on this. I'm just a guy that loves researching and studying. I got a bachelor's in religion, master's in theological studies. I got a Christian apologetics certificate from Biola. And so I do have, some education under my belt, but to say that I'm like a master of anything is far from it. That being said, I love studying and researching, and this is one thing as an apologist that comes up pretty regularly. And so I spent a lot of time researching this, and we're going to look at debunking what's known as the Christ myth theory. So what is it basically? Basically, the Christ myth theory is I hate using the word theory because according to the scientific method, a theory is first a hypothesis that has been tested and repeated and observed over and over and over. And then if it's consistent enough, it becomes a theory. And then a theory can turn into a law. But for sake of, boring, we have to use the word theory because that's how it's known in just regular vernacular. But the Christ myth theory is the idea that Jesus Christ never existed as a historical person in that while there may have been a person that was living during that day, all the attributes and accolades associated with Jesus Christ of Nazareth were actually borrowed from pagan religions. And so this is a very popular idea, at least in the last 20 years, but it is a fringe idea. There's a less and less people that are holding to this view, thankfully. So how did this view actually begin? Well, it began in the 18th century during the French Enlightenment era. And so there are two French philosophers, academics that were credited with sort of developing this idea that Jesus was borrowed from pagan religions. Constantine de Volney is a prominent leader. He is said to have, by his own admission, received a revelation from a quote unquote genie, not a genie in a lamp that you and I would think of, but some supernatural being that gave him a revelation that explained that all the religions shared a lot of commonality and they're all borrowed from one another. And so he really is one of the forefathers of this view, along with Charles Dupuy, who was one that claims, like a lot of these, that there's an astronomical connection between Jesus, the claims of Jesus. If we look at these two people, really, Devoney would be considered the one that popularized the theory and was able to translate it into English, whereas Dupuy was the one that actually systematized it into a framework. So this was back in the 18th century. From there, you move forward a little bit to a man by the name of Gerald Massey, who is a lay Egyptologist, like me, a lay researcher in this particular philosophical view. But it's said that while he could read and speak a lot of languages, he could read Egyptian to a certain degree. Now, this was during the time of the Rosetta Stone discoveries as well. And so, with the Rosetta Stone, there was an unlocking of different languages, specifically Egyptian. And so, it's claimed that he was able to look at the Egyptian hieroglyphics and sort of correlate them to the life of Jesus. These are the three people that are really big involved into propagating this view. But most notably, as of recent years, is the documentary Zeitgeist. And so Zeitgeist had come out, it pushed out this idea that Jesus's story is borrowed from like Krishna and Horus and Dionysus and some of these other pagan gods. From Zeitgeist, you have a few other very popular books and documentaries. Many of us are probably familiar with Bill Maher's Religulous book or documentary, but also D.M. Murdoch, or go, that's the pen name of the person. Achara S is another pen name, but The Origins of Christianity is another really big book that actually promoted this view. A lot of the information that's believed today regarding the Christ myth theory is coming from Zeitgeist and is coming from Murdoch's writings as well. However, after that, Kersey Graves's book, The World's 16 Crucified Saviors, was recently popularized yet again. Now, this book was written at the end of the 1800s, and basically what Kersey Graves was doing back in the 19th century was arguing that a crucified savior is not uncommon, that he ties people like Buddha and Krishna and Horus, and tries to argue that through those religions, their pagan gods have been crucified as well. Now, this isn't just based off of Gerald Massey's work of Egyptology, but also another one by the name of Godfrey Higgins. He has a few different volume works called Anacalypsis, and that's where a lot of this is coming from. So that's really how this sort of began. Now, what I want to look at, if we have plenty of time, is look at seven characters around this theory. Now, in the documentary Zeitgeist, I believe it only really focuses on five: Horus, Attis, Mithras, Krishna, and Dionysus. But I want to put in Buddha and Prometheus because those are covered in a lot of other of these works, to include the world's 16 crucified saviors. Now, I'm not going to have time to go over every single thing that Zeitgeist and others sort of claim that the story of Jesus was borrowed from these pagan gods, but I am going to cover the ones that are identified here below. What's interesting is that those that are promoting this theory, this view, don't really have the academic credentials to back up their claims. Now, I don't want to commit the fallacy of authority and say that just because someone has a degree, it means that whatever they're saying is true. However, to go ahead and make the claims that they're making, you would expect to have some sort of background education knowledge, or at least some sort of academia that would support it or corroborate it. What we're going to find out is a lot of the claims that they use are claims that are unsubstantiated, undocumented, and then, like Joseph Smith with the facsimiles of the Book of Abraham, they are actually misinterpreted and misunderstood. So we're going to see that going forward. So when we're looking at, these are some of the books, like I said, that we already talked about, but Horus, the very first one. It's claimed that the story of Jesus, that he was born of a virgin, had 12 disciples, that he was resurrected, baptized, and crucified, that these all are associated with Horus as well. They say that Horus had 12 disciples. They say that Horus was baptized by someone named Anoop, which they would associate with John the Baptist. So we're going to look at these claims. On the bottom of each of these slides, you're going to see an image of a book as well as a reference from where that book is found and what pages this information is on. I like doing citations to go ahead and fact check and prove all my work. While Budge is not necessarily the most trusted site as an author and an Egyptologist, there are many others that say the same exact things as him. But in the legends of the Egyptian gods, it's the fact that when you look into the story of Horus, Horus's mother Isis is never once said to have been a virgin. Matter of fact, if you remember the story of how Horus was conceived, it was after Isis had collected the disembodied parts of Osiris, and then from those disembodied parts, she fashioned a phallus through which she conceived Horus. Now, if anything, that would be considered a divine, miraculous birth, not a virgin birth. Nothing ever claims that Isis was a virgin. Regarding the claim of 12 disciples in the Journal of Egyptian Archaeology, this is found in the myth of Horus of Edfu, But the aspect is there's never any reference to how many quote unquote disciples Horus has. Matter of fact, depending on which account you read, there's a different amount of numbers. But also, they are never ever once identified as quote unquote disciples. Oftentimes, they're called harpooners and they're actually warriors. And so the claim that Horus had 12 disciples is unsubstantiated. Now, what about Horus being resurrected? Dr. Nora Scott, who interpreted the Metonyx Stela, she ended up interpreting it, and you can find this in other writings within Egyptology, that the only account of Horus, quote unquote, being resurrected is when he fell ill due to a sting of a scorpion. That was the only time. And so Isis had pled for his life, and one of the pagan Egyptian gods, Thoth, had actually revived him. Now, it is depending upon which story and account you read. Some do say that he was dead and brought back, but others do say that he was just very sick and very ill and was resuscitated or revived. Regardless, a resurrection for a pagan god is not uncommon because a lot of these pagan religions are focused around winter solstice, summer solstice, the rising of the sun, the lunar cycle. And so there's a resurrection theme that is allegorized in their religions anyway. So it's not uncommon to find tales of pagan gods, quote unquote, being resurrected. What about him being baptized? Translated out of the Egyptian Book of the Dead, which everybody talks about and everybody wants to know, there's a reference to, O you falcon who rise from the primordial water. This is the reference that most people associate Horus being baptized, and in reference to one of their deities named Anup. And so, with this baptism, they claim that he comes out of the waters. However, when you read into like Dr. Raymond Faulkner's work on the Egyptian Book of the Dead, this is not describing any type of baptism, but rather something coming into existence. That is it. And so, they're trying to correlate waters and someone coming out of the waters as a baptism when it is something entirely different. Now, what about Horus being crucified? No Egyptian text ever points to, mentions, or even alludes to the fact that Horus was crucified. The only arguments that I've ever found as far as making this claim is with a painting similar to the one that you see there on the top of Horus's arms outstretched. And so they see this and they correlate what looks like the ankh in the size in the symbol of a cross, and they say his arms are outstretched. It's a crucifixion, just like Jesus Christ. And so they're trying to correlate it. But actually, if you were to read Dr. Faulkner's work in his translation, these paintings are what's called a hymn to the sun, in which he is simply praising the sun disk in the Egyptian religion. So there is no crucifixion according to Horus that is ever claimed by any scholarly Egyptologist. So Horus we can put aside. What about Attis? Attis is one of the Greek gods. It said that he has a virgin birth. He was born on December 25th. He was crucified and resurrected. So, when we look into some historical writings, one called Pausanias, The Description of Greece, you can find various volumes of this translated by different people. There is never any mention of Attis's mother being a virgin, period. And so, as you can see here, the birth of Attis is often said to be occurred when the gods cut off a male organ of a hermaphrodite named Agdistis, whom they believed was a demon. This phallus ended up growing from an almond tree, from which the daughter, depending on which text you read or which religion you read, either Nana or Sebele, took it, laid it upon her bosom. The fruit disappeared, and she became pregnant with Attis. And so, again, there is no reference to a virgin in the story. If anything, you could argue it's a miraculous or divine birth, but certainly not a virgin birth. That is unique to Christianity. The claim that Attis was born on December 25th, and what you're going to see this oftentimes throughout this presentation, is merely asserted. There is no substantiation, there's no reference, no citation to any of these births of these pagan gods on December 25th. However, it should not be uncommon that they're going to claim that pagan gods are going to be born around December 25th, because that would have been normally around the winter solstice, which occurs typically around December 22nd, 23rd. So having a quote unquote birth around the winter solstice would not be uncommon, because a lot of these pagan religions were agrarian cultures anyways. Also, the Bible never says Jesus was born on December 25th. There are arguments for, there are plenty of arguments against. We just don't know when Jesus Christ was born. The arguments for Jesus' birth in December 25th came centuries after his crucifixion. So is the same with the arguments of these pagan gods being born on December 25th. It came after the crucifixion of Jesus Christ. Now, was Attis crucified? Again, there's no record of Attis being crucified. One account of Attis's death was the fact that he was killed by a boar that Zeus sent to kill him. And then there's another one where he cut off his phallus in the presence of this hermaphrodite during a marriage song. And so there's no reference of any crucifixion. The only deaths that are recorded, and most of them can be seen in Pausanias's work, are the fact of him being either killed by a boar or him dying from self-mutilation. What about Attis's resurrection? Again, after Attis kills himself by cutting his phallus off, he Agdistis pled for Zeus to not only allow his body to decay, not to allow it to rot as well. And from this, the legend goes that Zeus turned Attis into a tree. This is not a bodily resurrection. This is a, if you will, a transformation, a metamorphosis. But there is no argument, no citation for Attis being resurrected. Now you get to a common one that a lot of people are familiar with Mithra. Now, what's interesting about Mithra, ignore the title that says Attis. I just didn't edit that correctly. One other thing they try to say is Mithra was born with swaddling clothes. Now, we understand that from the birth of Jesus in the manger, and so they try to argue that as well. So, David Olancey's Origins of the Mithraic Mysteries book, published by Oxford, this is a claim that, again, Acharya S., D.M. Murdoch, that they propagate. But again, there's the only reference to Mithra ever being born is he's always being born out of a rock or from a collision of rocks. There's no birth of Mithra coming from a woman, unless you can associate a rock being a virgin because a rock has never had intercourse. You can't argue for a virgin birth for Mithra. But yet, that's not going to stop these critics from arguing that to be the case. Just because there's no woman involved, they're going to argue a virgin birth. December 25th, again, it's the same thing. There's no real strong claim for this date being accepted for his birth. However, when Rome did adopt Mithra, Mithra, from what I remember, originally started out as an Iranian god. When Rome adopted Mithra, that date is mentioned, but that's after Jesus Christ as well. What about this argument of being wrapped in swaddling clothes after his birth? Again, this is just assertions. There is no citation of any kind that talks about Mithra being born with wearing swaddling clothes. Again, all his birth is indicating that he came forth out of a rock. And then I believe this is an Iranian professor in his book in the Mithraic Studies, Mithra in Mesopotamia. He states that Mithra is never crucified. The only death that is ever understood within the legend of Mithra is that he kills a bull. That's it. He kills a bull. Nothing kills him. He doesn't die. There's no recorded evidence of this crucifixion. And so this claim of him being crucified is, again, unsubstantiated. Moving forward, Krishna. Krishna is also said to have been born in a stable, and that Krishna is the second person of the Trinity. Those are very familiar to Jesus Christ, are they not? So, what about a virgin birth? Well, Krishna's mother Devaki is never once mentioned as being a virgin. Matter of fact, if you read the Hindu texts, you'll see that before Krishna's birth or coming, that there were numerous siblings, numerous other children that Devaki and her husband had already had. And so, if anything, that would speak contrary to Devaki being a virgin. Again, another claim of December 25th. No citation within any Hindu text or scholar argues for this date. However, if you wanted to look it up, it is commonly held, at least today, that his birth was July in the fourth millennium BC. And so that's obviously about 6 months away from a December 25th date. What about him being born in a stable? Well, according to the Hindu texts, Krishna was born in jail. Krishna was born in jail, in prison, and not in a stable. And so, again, this is an assertion that is made. Unless you want to define a stable as a prison, it's not going to hold any water. What about Krishna being crucified? Krishna was never crucified. The only death that's associated with Krishna is when there was a hunter that mistook Krishna's foot for an animal and he shot him in the foot, which ended up killing Krishna. And this, again, is found in one of the Hindu texts. And so this is not written by somebody outside of the Hindu religion, but is actually one of their religious texts. What about the second person of the Trinity? Krishna is not the second person of the Trinity because Hinduism does not believe in a Trinity. Hinduism does not have the concept of three persons in one God. They have what's known as the Trimurti, which is three separate gods, and Krishna is not even a part of one of those gods. The three main gods are Brahma, Vishnu, and Shiva. Brahma is the god that they believe created everything. Vishnu is the one through which he comes in as a form of an avatar. And Krishna is merely an avatar of Vishnu according to Hinduism. And so there is no second person of the Trinity within Hinduism. There is a second god of the Trimurti, but that second god could be argued as Vishnu and clearly not Krishna. Krishna would merely just be an avatar of Vishnu. Now we move on to Dionysus. The thing that Dionysus is very famous for is turning water into wine, which is something that Jesus Christ did at the miracle of Cana during the wedding. But first, let's look into his virgin birth. Well, there's a couple different stories as far as how Dionysus was born. One of the stories is that Zeus impregnated Semele, and Hera caused Semele's death, and Zeus saved the unborn of Dionysus by sewing Dionysus into his own Zeus's thigh, and from his thigh Dionysus was born. However, if you were to read the Iliad from Homer and Hesiod, they describe Dionysus as being born normally to the princess. Though it's pointed out that the thigh birth version appears to be a later developed, but there's no ancient text that you can find that describes Semele as a virgin, as we would know as the Jesus Christ story. December 25th, again, there is no reference to December 25th date. The only reference is traced back to the 4th century by a Latin writer. And again, it's only a December 25th date because it aligns with the winter solstice. However, the winter solstice would have been December 22nd, December 23rd, and that would have been the date in which they were using for the birth of Dionysus. What about this claim that Dionysus turned water into wine? Well, he did not turn water into wine. And so, if you were to read some ancient books that actually talk about it, Dionysus was really poured water, poured wine into the lake. There was this aspect in which Dionysus was turning into wine, comes from Dionysiaca, written by Nonnus in the 5th century. Nonnus writes that Dionysus poured water into the wine. He did not transform the lake water into wine. He merely poured it in there. It says clearly in the book as well, on page 501, that the newly poured wine. And so there's an aspect of adding wine into the lake. There was no transformation or metamorphosis of the lake water turning into red wine or white wine or whatever the case was, just that it was saturated with wine. And so the assertion that Dionysus turned water into wine is again not only unsubstantiated, but misunderstood and not cited correctly. Resurrection. The Count of Dionysus resurrecting his mother from the realms of Hades is only found in Pausanias's document in his writing. And basically, this story about Dionysus trying to resurrect his mother is the fact that she wasn't necessarily dead per se, but just trying to bring her out of the realm of Hades. Other than that, in some oral legends, there is nothing in antiquity that argues that Dionysus had resurrected people in the same way that Jesus resurrected Lazarus or Paul resurrected the Eutychus who fell out of the window when Paul was preaching his 12-hour sermon. The resurrection is merely alluded to and not ever substantiated. Again, another assertion made is the fact that Dionysus himself was resurrected. However, this is interesting because Archaria, or that D.M. Murdoch lady that wrote the book, she's perpetuating the claim found within an article of a classical journal written in 1824. She refers to a footnote which is speaking about funeral rites regarding Osiris of the Egyptian religion. And so this is not even talking about Dionysus. And so this is another assertion made, perpetuated to try to push falsehood into truth. Dionysus is also said to have been riding back into the homeland, Holy Land on a donkey. However, they're associating this with Dionysus, but this is not the case. When you read into Pausanias's writing, there's a legend that Dionysus brought Hephaestus back to Olympus after being cast out. And so this was not even Dionysus riding on a donkey. But even still, even if somebody rode a donkey back into their holy land, Mount Olympus, that would merely just be a correlation fallacy, and we'll talk about that here in a little bit. Buddha, this is one that a lot of people overlook. Buddha said to have been born of a virgin, December 25th, crushed a serpent's head, that sounds familiar, spent 3 days in hell, and then resurrected. Well, again, no Buddhist text indicates whose Buddha's mother, Maya, was a virgin. There's nothing that ever says that. Matter of fact, the only text that mentions how Maya became pregnant was when she had a dream of a white elephant that entered her, and then she became pregnant. Again, this would not be a virgin birth. This would merely be considered a miraculous birth. Again, a claim that he was born on December 25th is unsubstantiated, as Buddhists often look at April and May for the date of his birth. About Buddha crushing the head of a serpent, I have found nothing to go ahead and substantiate that. In reviewing this book, The Life of Buddha as a Legend in History, there are no references to him killing a serpent. There is one reference to a fire snake that attempted to burn Buddha alive while he was meditating, but that was not him crushing any serpent's head. Also, what's interesting are the serpents, the Nagas, the dragon spirits and serpent spirits. They're often said to protect Buddha while he's meditating from disasters and other enemies and things that would harm him. So the serpent spirits are said to protect him versus harm him, but there's no reference to him crushing a serpent's head. This idea that Buddha had spent 3 days in hell totally misunderstands what Buddhists actually believe. The Buddhist concept of hell called Naraka is very, very, very different. There are 6 realms within Buddhist ideology, Buddhist religion of reincarnation that's also known as samsara. In Naraka, or their version of hell, is the lowest of those realms. Basically, the rebirth cycle, the reincarnation samsara is temporary. It's caused by one's karma in their current life because the whole purpose of them is to go ahead and be reborn so that they can continuously be improved as a person to hopefully no longer have to go through the reincarnation cycle. This is seen in the false claim that he was resurrected. There is no reference to a resurrection in Buddhism. Matter of fact, the pinnacle of Buddhism is no resurrection. It's nirvana and then parinirvana, in the fact that the reincarnation cycle, samsara cycle, ceases. And so the goal is cessation, not resurrection. And so that quite clearly refutes the idea that Buddha was resurrected, because that is not even the goal within Buddhism. Finally, is Prometheus. Prometheus is interesting because it said that he had received a wound on his side and he suffered for humanity, and that he was betrayed by a fisherman named Peter. So we'll look into this. The virgin birth of Prometheus, written in Theogony by Hesiod, states that he was born through normal means by his mother and father. And so he was actually recorded as a third child, not a virgin birth. So this is another assertion. Crucified and resurrection. Nothing in antiquity states that he was crucified. However, Zeus chained him to a large boulder because of what Prometheus did to go ahead and make Zeus mad, and therefore Zeus had chained him up to a rock, in which an eagle is said to go there daily to eat his liver. His liver would regenerate, and then this would go on daily until Zeus decided to stop. This is not a crucifixion, and this is not a resurrection, unless you want to say his liver was resurrected after the eagle ate it. The wounds on his side, the only side wounds that Prometheus had received was from the eagle itself, not from a spear. Prometheus did not suffer for humanity. A matter of fact, Prometheus's actions brought suffering and pain to man. First, Prometheus tricked Zeus into taking a portion of food, and then later, Prometheus stole fire to give it back to mankind, forcing Zeus to punish mankind for Prometheus's actions. This is not an atonement. This is not Jesus suffering for humanity so that humanity can have a personal relationship with Jesus. This is Prometheus's actions causing suffering upon humanity. Totally different situation. What about this idea of Prometheus being portrayed by Peter? Well, this is interesting. If you look into the Dictionary of Greek and Roman gods and mythology, you will find out that there is not even a reference to this name. And so it states that Petraeus, Peter, is simply a synonym of the name Oceanus. However, according to Greek mythology, the only reference to the name is the name of a god, which is a surname of Poseidon, given by the Thessalians. And so there's no text that states Petraeus or Peter is a synonym for Oceanus. Also, Oceanus and Poseidon are two different gods. While the one is a Titan, Poseidon is an Olympian, so they are two different gods. Finally, the only betrayal story in the story of Prometheus is Prometheus' betrayal against Zeus, not anybody betraying Prometheus himself. And so this reference to this person named Peter in the story is unsubstantiated. So when we look at least these seven characters around this theory, we all understand that they're unsubstantiated claims, or they're misinterpreted and misunderstood. And when people that have the scholarly background to know the religions, and we look at old works like Homer's Iliad or Pausanias or Theogony, we find that the ancient texts, not oral legends, but the ancient texts really write contrary. So how is this still believed today? Well, I believe it's the fact that if anybody can speak well, or if anybody can produce the best looking video, they can make anything appear to be true. Whether you see it with the Zeitgeist movie, or you see it in that false documentary where they're trying to attack eternal security, it's a well built, well designed, and produced video with some people that look and sound like they're talking truth, but it's anything but true. And so a great orator can make anything sound true. Also, it's like the old adage goes, a lie told once remains a lie, but a lie told 1,000 times becomes the truth. These lies are just propagated and continued on by people that are critics of Christianity, so it's accepted to be true. There's also personal biases involved, because when somebody is antagonistic to the religion of Christianity, they're going to view everything against Christianity. And then finally, people don't even think for themselves. We live in a day and age where everything is instant gratification. We're scrolling through reels and shorts, and we want to be told what to believe. We don't want to take the time to personally study these things out. Also, we want to ignore logical fallacies such as the correlation fallacy, which I mentioned a few different times. What is the correlation fallacy? First, let me ask you, who are you thinking of? If I were to say that there was a ship over 100 years ago that set off on her maiden voyage, that ship was called unsinkable. The ship left Europe to cross the Atlantic Ocean. The ship struck an iceberg and sank in April. And then more than half of the people died because there weren't enough lifeboats. If I were to read all those facts off to you, what boat would you think of? You would think of the Titanic, I would most commonly argue. However, you would be totally incorrect. Those facts are actually from a book in a three-part writing series by Morgan Robertson. Part of the writing series is called The Wreck of the Titan. This was actually written 14 years before the Titanic incident. The Wreck of the Titan was a novel, a fictional novel that happened in 1898, well before the sinking of the Titanic. The book, The Wreck of the Titan, did not cause the Titanic to sink. Just because there are similarities between different events or different accounts does not mean that one caused the other or that one is based upon the other. For example, Christmas is a pagan holiday because the evergreen trees that are celebrated with. The, that's correlation fallacy. The resurrection is no different than the rising of pagan deities based upon the lunar cycle. Again, that's correlation fallacy. Just because these things are seen elsewhere doesn't mean they correlate, they cause, or it's based upon one another. But there's a lot of scholars that rejected Christ-Smith's theory. Why is that? And I'm almost done. Most of what's known about pagan religions comes after the advent of Christianity, so it's after the resurrection and crucifixion of Jesus Christ. Information about Jesus can actually be verified historically. Pagan stories cannot. Most of them are oral legends. Even most of them are written by people outside of that pagan religion. There's evidence of dishonest, quote unquote, scholarly work, such as we see in Murdoch's case, where she's citing a footnote in a book referring it to Dionysus, when in actuality that footnote is referring to Osiris. There's a lot of dishonest work. Jesus' resurrection is unique and life-changing. It's one of the arguments for why that tomb was believed to be empty and why it's still held that view today. Professional scholars pretty much unanimously reject this Christ myth theory, and it's seen as a fringe view. I believe the historicity of Jesus Christ is the most well-attested fact of ancient history. Whether you're a skeptic or a believer, if you're honest with your studies and your research, you can't deny that there is evidence to support the claim that Jesus of Nazareth actually existed. And so that historical evidence there's a preponderance of evidence. So with this, there's some biblical admonition that we need to make sure that our faith does not stand in the wisdom of men, but in the power of God. And that as Christians, we need to go ahead and make sure that we are not spoiled through vain philosophy and vain deceit after traditions of men. I just read a post today about William Lane Craig and his views as far as certain ages of the earth, ages of the universe, and people arguing as far as he's taken man's philosophy and inserting it into the Bible. And so that's a discussion for another day. But too many people love philosophy and hate theology. I would say we need to love theology and hate philosophy to a degree, if you will. Philosophy is good. I do want to go ahead and just let people know that if anybody does want any of these references, these are found free on the C4C website. I do have individual ones that are actually free PDF downloads for the different gods, as well as a large 24 by 36 poster that has all of them together as well. And that is my presentation. So I will stop the presentation slides and open it up if anybody has any questions.